We have agreed to implement a nationwide cessation of hostilities to begin in a target of 1 week's time.
The United States, Russia and other leading powers agreed to a cessation of hostilities and humanitarian assistance in Syria. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Given the complexity and number of actors involved in Syria, it comes as no surprise that the announcement of a possible cessation of hostilities by the end of this week was met with both optimism and skepticism. More than 250,000 people have died in nearly 5 years of conflict, while 11 million others have fled their homes. Now comes word of the latest tragic incidents. 2 hospitals in northern Syria hit by airstrikes, including one supported by Médecins Sans Frontières or Doctors Without Borders. At least 17 people were killed, including at least 1 child. Later, we'll talk with an advisor to the Syrian government, but first, for more on the ceasefire agreement, we turn to CCTV's Mikhail Bar-David in Istanbul. And Mikhail, there's now less than a week before the scheduled cessation of hostilities. And here's the thing, many other actors involved in Syria are not party to the agreement. So, given the challenges, is it likely to happen, and how effective do you think it will be?
Well, Anand, that is a challenge in itself. First of all, the 2 key players are the United States and Russia. They have to put a lot of pressure on their own allies for the fighting to stop, but they also have to stop the fighting themselves. For example, on Friday, the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has said in a televised interview that they would continue fighting until they would retake the whole of Syria. So that is not a good signal from the Syrian government. Meanwhile, when we're talking about Russia, Russia had already announced that they would continue bombardments, and they had announced that they would exclude different terrorist organizations from this agreement, including the Islamic State and al-Nusra Front. But there are many who criticize Russia, saying that when Russia says they are targeting terrorists, in fact, they are targeting rebel forces, opposition forces. So that is a main challenge in itself as well. So we're seeing a lot of challenges when it comes to whether or not the fighting could end, whether this agreement could be effective at all.
Mikhail, the other part of the agreement is, of course, allowing humanitarian assistance to get through. Give us a sense of the size of the problem and whether safe passage can be assured to those in need.
Yes, the situation is very critical in terms of humanitarian need. Just in January, the United Nations had announced there were 400,000 people in besieged areas in 15 different locations. Now the Syrian government has advanced since then, and it's reported that at least 500,000 people are living in besieged areas in 17 different locations. Now, when we're talking about providing aid and the passage of aid, there are different obstacles in that sense as well. When we're talking about Islamic State, for example, the United Nations can only provide aid with the method of dropping with parachutes, and that is difficult in itself. When we're talking about rebel forces, there are so many factions, different factions, and they don't have a common structure when it comes to how they would allow passage of aid. For example, there was an instance when the United Nations was asked to provide aid but drop it in the middle of the road and then back off, and it was later reported that the rebel forces had taken some parts of the aid for themselves and only given some part of it, so the rest of it to the people in need. So that is also an obstacle. Now when we're talking about the Syrian government, they are trying to surround the city of Aleppo and trap the rebel forces inside it. So even if they did agree to provide aid for the people in need inside, that would of course be a difficulty, be a challenge. So even though there are good intentions behind this agreement, whether or not it would be effective at all is still a question mark on.
Okay, thanks, Mikhail. That's CCTV's Mikhail Bar-David reporting from Istanbul. Joining us now from Damascus is Bassam Abu Abdullah. He's the director of the Center for Strategic Studies at Damascus University. Dr. Abdullah, thanks for joining us. How committed do you think President Bashar al-Assad is to this ceasefire agreement? Because we have an agreement in place now, but President Assad is already talking about retaking the whole country.
I think absolutely. I will to explain one important thing. The talks in Germany was about cessation of hostilities. It's first. Secondly, not ceasefire. Secondly, is that Mr. Sergei Lavrov explained that it's not covering the Aleppo or north of Aleppo, or where is ISIS and Al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations. So, and I think today or yesterday, Mr. Lavrov, he said the percentage of success in this agreement is a 49%. So it doesn't mean that the military operations will stop in the north of Aleppo or in around Aleppo, and it doesn't mean that it will be cover the Idlib or Raqqa or many places. So the until now I can't understand where is these places, but to understand what President Assad said, it's absolutely he is the president of the Syrian Arab Republic. We have terrorist organization in many places in Syria, and this is his duty to say that, and his duty to do that for the whole Syria. Besides that, the all international resolution in the Security Council talking about the sovereignty of Syria and integrity of its territory. So there is no confrontation or there is no introduction between what President Assad said and the reality on the ground.
So the violence will continue then, from what you were saying. Where will it stop? Which parts of the country will it stop in?
I will tell you, when the regional players, absolutely like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and others, they will stop financing and supporting terrorist organizations, and I think it will be decreasing the percentage of violence. But it's not violence. We should differ between two important things. Absolutely, we are inside a huge war. This war, it's not internal, absolutely war. It's approximately international war, because many players are involving inside Syria, and they are not interested in the Syrian people or the future of the Syrian people, who can decide who will rule Syria or what kind of constitution and what is the political process. But when we are seeing what Saudi Arabia, which is a Wahhabi regime, I cannot be convinced that Saudi Arabia can help the Syrian people to build its political future, because Saudi Arabia itself needs to reforms and needs to change its mentality and its approaches to its people and to other people in the Arab world.
Right, now some of these outside players that you are talking about include countries like Saudi Arabia. You talked about Saudi Arabia a moment ago. Also includes Turkey. Both these countries have threatened to send in ground troops into Syria. Is that likely? The Russians have warned that if that happens, this could lead to a world war.
Yes, I think that Saudi Arabia and Turkey will not attack as it's showing us. I think yesterday the Minister of Defense of Turkey, he said that Turkey will not send any troops to Syria, and it's absolutely Damascus looking for that, Moscow, Tehran, as aggression. And you know that this aggression it means that as Syrians, we will resist it, and I don't think that it will be add any added value to the situation. It will be increasing the situation of violence here. It will, and it doesn't matter for us that what they are declaring, because they are lying for more than 5 years. Mr. Erdogan, he is supporting ISIS, he is supporting all terrorist organizations, and I don't think that Saudi Arabia now is very interested in the future of Syrian people, because if Saudi Arabia interested in the future of Syrian people, they should interested in the future of Yemeni people or Saudi people. So this is they are lying with that. They are if they will come on the ground, I think it means that they are looking for Raqqa. And I think Washington declared that they would support any, what they called it, Sunni power to liberate Raqqa from ISIS. But I think they will be very late, and the battle in the north of Aleppo, it will be a very strategic one. Because of that, they are feeling that everything is going from their hands now.
Well, of course, while the politicians talk in Munich, there is a very serious, very dire humanitarian crisis in Syria right now. 14 million people affected, in need of aid, needing basics like food, medicines. Part of this agreement is designed to allow for airdrops to these people, to allow for safe passage. But given this widespread violence, I mean, is that likely? Is that possible?
There is no party in the world very interested in the humanitarian side more than the Syrian government or we are as a Syrian. And I think that to talk about the humanitarian side of it's only politics, because if they are interested in that, they can help to stop the violence. But I think it is using as an instrument in the politics, because example, Saudi Arabia or the United States or Europe, if they are interested in that, they should pressure on Turkey, they should pressure on Saudi Arabia to stop financing a terrorist organization inside Syria, and it will be help a lot in the humanitarian side for the Syrian people. So I think it's politics only. Nobody interested in the humanitarian aid of the Syrian people. But now what they talked in Munich, as you mentioned, between Russian and the American, maybe they will accelerate this operation, because there are surrounded places in Syria, especially as example Deir ez-Zor, where is ISIS, and they will help that. Maybe it will be make things easier for negotiations. But I think that we are in front of very difficult process, complicated process, because it's not Syrian dialogue. Because if it was Syrian dialogue, it's easy, because a lot of players in the international arena and regional arena, they are involved in Syrian crisis.
Okay, Dr. Bassam Abu Abdullah, thanks for joining us, sir. We need to take a break right now. More on the crisis in Syria right after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the planned ceasefire in Syria. Joining us from London is journalist and documentary filmmaker Roshan Mohammed Saleh. Here with us in Washington is Omar Hosseina. He's the Director of Public Relations and Outreach at the Syrian American Council. And also joining us from London is Syrian political commentator Amar Wakaf. He's the Director of Gnosos, focusing on Syria and the Middle East. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Amar Wakaf in London, let me start with you. So we have the ceasefire, which has been signed right now, but no sooner had it been signed, we have more violence. 2 hospitals being hit, the violence continuing. Question is, could there ever be a ceasefire in Syria, given that there are literally hundreds of myriad groups that make up the opposition there?
Well, good evening. I don't think they spoke specifically about ceasefire, but probably cessation of hostilities. I think what they had in mind was to open the door for some local reconciliations, perhaps, style sort of ceasefires. But on a national scale, the problem we have is that the Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, Al-Qaeda branch in Syria, is so entangled with other militant groups that it's going to be very hard for those other groups to accept any cessation of hostilities. I think one big indication was that when the Munich Declaration was announced, the Syrian opposition, the Riyadh Conference opposition, immediately went to refuse this particular agreement. And I think what they had in mind was that if they would accept it, and the cessation of hostilities would be as expected, partial, so we're going to stop with these groups, we're not going to stop with the terrorist groups, then they would fear that there would be some internal fighting in between the groups. If someone decides to stop, then probably the bigger ones, which are the more radical ones, could actually come and swallow them up. So that's why nobody is interested, and I don't think that has much of a chance of success, unfortunately.
Omar, that doesn't sound very good, that this won't succeed. What is your understanding of this agreement? I mean, here we have, let's say, Russia, one party to this agreement. Ceasefire is signed, but Russian bombing continues.
Definitely, you know, the unfortunate thing is that most of the time we have these ceasefire agreements or these political talks, we actually see an escalation in the violence. And this is the second time that that has happened. So after the Geneva talks began and the talks began and the opposition was speaking with the UN Special Envoy, we saw the largest number of Russian bombings happen in Aleppo that basically ever happened in this conflict. The Russians escalated the strikes. Today, you know, after the Russians and the United States agreed upon a cessation of hostilities, like Ammar said, not a ceasefire, but a cessation of hostilities, we saw Russian airstrikes target a hospital for Doctors Without Borders. This is something Doctors Without Borders just came out and said this morning. So unfortunately, we're seeing an escalation in violence. And the same thing happened in the past Geneva process, where the process began, but the amount of fighting we saw on the ground, especially from the regime side, exceptionally escalated. The amount of killing escalated, the amount of refugees escalated. You know, just when these parties came to talk, we saw 70,000 refugees leave the country from Aleppo due to the Russian bombing. And the reason why is because no ceasefire can exist without the proper leverage, and the United States needs to take the proper leverage to get the sides to the table and to get an actual ceasefire in place, because that's the most important thing, is to first get a ceasefire in place if there's ever going to be a political solution. The longer this conflict goes on, the stronger the radicals and the terrorist groups on all sides become.
Well, it needs to be enforced, right?
It definitely needs to be enforced, and the UN Security Council Resolution 2254 called for a cessation of hostilities and full humanitarian access, which Russia signed on to, and then Russia continues to bomb and kill civilians while they have signed on to the ceasefire, which basically makes it words on paper.
All right, let me go to Roshan. Roshan, I want you to take a listen to what the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had to say about the agreement. Let's watch.
Не все совпадает в оценках происходящего.
We do not agree on everything. There are differences. That is why I wish to repeat and to clarify these problems. The key in Syria is to have direct contacts for cooperation between the army, the US-led coalition, and the Russian army, which is in Syria at the invitation of the legitimate government.
So, Roshan, here we have a situation where we have an agreement brokered by Russia and the United States. Sergei Lavrov making the point there that they are not in agreement on everything. Do these two major powers have separate agendas here, which is undermining this agreement?
Well, I think different parties will understand different things from this agreement. Why would Russia stop bombing? Why would the Syrian Arab army stop fighting on the ground? They have the advantage. It's the rebels, the Syrian opposition, they're the ones that are desperate for a ceasefire. And it's ironic because I think during the course of this conflict, it's actually been the so-called rebels that have refused a political solution. They've always laid down the proviso, that Assad must leave at whatever cost. But now suddenly they're calling for a ceasefire and a halt to Syrian Arab army activities on the ground and Russian bombing. Look, obviously at the moment we are at perhaps a decisive point in the war where perhaps this horrible war, which has dragged on for too long, may be coming to an end. I think that, or the major elements of the conflict might be coming to the end. Certainly if the Syrian Arab army and the Russians can encircle Aleppo and expel the terrorist groups which are present in Aleppo. If they can seal the Turkish border and the Jordanian border to the south and the Iraqi border as well, then this conflict is all but over, and then it will become just a prolonged, terrorist campaign, mopping up exercise. So I don't see any reason. I know this is all politics. It's all politicians talking and blaming each other, but I don't see any reason why Russia and the Syrian Arab army, Assad in other words, should stop their offensive on the ground because they're winning.
Ammar, what do you make of that? I mean, is there any compulsion for these two sides to stop fighting? Right now, Bashar al-Assad has, with considerable Russian help, been able to recapture much of the territory he lost in western Syria. Is he under any kind of pressure right now to say, okay, I will stop ceasefire?
I think what really the underlying issue here isn't winning over armed groups or armed rebellion. It's about what sort of project do those people have in mind. So if you think of, we need to distinguish between the groups and between people who oppose the government. Some of them really just don't like the government. They need a better governance system, they need a more democratic system, that's fine. However, the dangerous ones are the ones who have a completely different setup in mind for Syria. So instead of having Syria as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious place where everybody could feel as a first-degree citizen, what is in the minds of some of the Al-Qaeda, especially Al-Qaeda and Salafi-affiliated groups, is to have a country in Syria whereby other people who are not from the certain majority, sect majority, would be second-degree citizens, and people would be judged by skin color, just like what is happening in Lebanon, just like what is happening in Iraq. I think those people, you cannot reconcile with them, not as people, but as a project. And these people have been identified, fortunately, by the international community, just like the ISIS people, the Jabhat al-Nusra people, and the affiliated groups, as terrorists. Now, you cannot stop fighting those because it's not a political issue, it's an existential issue. So the problem we have is how to get Syrians, and we need to understand also that there are so many non-Syrians amongst their ranks, especially the ideological groups in Syria. Now, how to bring Syrians from those people and give them some sort of a, amnesty, I don't know what it would be, to convince them that this sort of project is only going to bring havoc and destruction into this country, and so start a political process with disregard of what those ideologues have in mind, and continue fighting them because we believe it's the only way. They really have no place for democracy. One specific paper that they had, or one specific thought, say, democracy is an ideology to allow multiple ideas to coexist. And there is no multiple ideas in Islam, there is only one true idea. So you cannot live with those people. You have to keep fighting and at the same time try to extend some sort of an arm to other Syrians who would be willing to cross the bridge with you.
What do you think, Omar?
I think the ultimate goal has to be democracy. It has to be multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian democracy through a political solution. I'm glad that the United States and Russia have agreed upon this as the ultimate goal. Unfortunately, without the United States taking leadership and taking the lead in pushing for this, for a free and democratic Syria for all Syrians, there can't be a political solution. And so with Assad in power, there can't be a political solution. You're not going to get the players that are on the opposition side, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, on board without getting rid of Assad in power. Now, at the same time, the Russians and the Iranians and the others that are supporting Assad have interests in Syria. And a political solution has to have a compromise from every single side, from every single group. However, you cannot get there without the protection of civilians.
All right, let me go to Roshan. Roshan, is there a political way out of this?
Well, your guest in Washington there seems to paint the Syrian opposition, the rebels, as kind of the military arm of Amnesty International or something. I mean, this is crazy. I mean, the Syrian opposition is dominated by the most extreme jihadi groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, the guys that blew up the Twin Towers, the guys that attacked London, the guys that attacked Madrid, and ISIS, we know about them, and very conservative Salafi Takfiri groups like Ahrar al-Sham. These are I mean, show me a moderate rebel in Syria. I mean, this whole notion is crazy. The so-called Syrian revolution is a terrorist revolution. This is the fact. And your guest also says that Iran is sponsoring terrorism. That might kind of play well with an American audience, but the fact is that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey have been letting terrorists, cross their borders, fund them, arm them. They have created this terrorist revolution. So, I think your guest there in Washington, his words are ironic. However, I would say that despite everything that I've just said, I do believe that I've always said that a political solution is the way out of this. I think that I do believe that Assad is winning at the moment and he has the upper hand, but I don't believe he can attain a complete victory, not with the West, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey sponsoring the terrorists in Syria. So I think that, you know, some kind of messy political deal has to come about, perhaps with Assad retaining Damascus, perhaps Aleppo, perhaps Latakia, and Turkey and Saudi Arabia getting some influence in the north. This has become an internationalized conflict. There are so many parts, unfortunately it's out of the hands of the Syrians themselves now, I hate to say that, but that's the truth. And I think everyone has to get their piece of the pie before this horrible conflict can come to an end.
Let me go to Amar in London for a final word on this. Amar, what is going to work here? What kind of what needs to happen right now to push this process forward? I mean, and do you agree with what Russian was saying, that it might have to be some kind of partition of Syria where different people, different powers have control over different parts of the country?
Well, what we know for sure is that the central government in Damascus is having none of that. They are now having this not very announced push deep into ISIS territory towards Raqqa, and the Raqqa province, we need to understand, is the only province that is completely out of the control of the government in Damascus. So in a sense, they're saying, you know, we have the sovereignty, we consider ourselves sovereign over the entire Syrian plateau, and that's the way they're heading. You cannot divide Syria unless you do that along ethnic lines, and that's not going to solve any problem. That's going to agitate also or create all sorts of problems. Picking up on the discussion from Omar in your studios over there, I think we need to look at it differently. We know that Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar are not going to stop funding rebels and sending arms and wreaking havoc, in a sense, in Syria unless President Assad steps down. However, there are quite a few Syrians, let us say enough Syrians, who believe President Assad and his government is their best option in order to fight off or fend off certain threats, some of them existential, some of them economic, and so on. Now, we need to reconcile somehow between these two. We cannot say that if we take President Assad everything is going to be fine, because we are not going to be sure how this group of people would behave. I mean, if they felt, currently they feel that the Syrian government, because it stands on its feet and they played a big role in keeping it on its feet, they feel that they are safe. If they feel that they are not safe, then who knows what they can do. So we need to convince the political rivals in Syria first, and probably Turkey and Saudi Arabia, to trust a process rather than to trust some sort of this person or that person, and that process could produce something good.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.